This video is on section 1 and 2. Section 1 and 2 go on 3 different blocks as explained in our instructions. Here's a look at one of the blocks. So we're going to start with section 1. So what we need to do is hoop a lightweight cutaway stabilizer. So hopefully you can see this here. And I've gone ahead and pre-shrunk this with a hot iron because it does shrink a little bit and we don't want it to shrink after our blocks are done. So we hoop our pre-shrunk lightweight cutaway stabilizer. We're going to need a rectangle of fabric 1, rectangle of fabric 2, smaller rectangles of fabric 5 and fabric 6. Now this would be for sections 1 and 2. We will need a wash away thread, a neutral thread, and an embroidery bobbin thread. Now here's a tip for your neutral thread. If you pick a color that's different than your wash away, so I have a gray, it's going to help you later on in aligning your sections. So we're going to get started with section 1. We're going to put our wash away thread in the needle and stitch our placement stitches. So here's a look at our completed section 1. We're going to stitch 2 of these in the hoop. So again, I have my lightweight cutaway stabilizer. I've got my machine threaded with wash away thread and embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch the placement stitches. So this is the back of my hoop from step 1, and I did have the thread cutter turned off because I like to have a cleaner looking back. So I will go ahead and turn my hoop over and clip the threads so I have a nice clean looking back. So now we're ready for step 2. So for step 2, we're going to place fabric 2 in this center section. And a handy thing to have is a glue pen. So we just take our glue pen and we put a little bit of glue on that section. And then we want to have about a 1/4 inch at the top and a little bit more at the bottom. Oops. And we glue it down. We also want to check our points there, make sure that we have enough. We have about a 1/4 inch on each side. That's about right. So we get that glued in place. And then step 2 will be continuing with the water-soluble thread, and we'll stitch this down. So after we get that stitched, we're going to trim these 2 sides to a scant 1/4 inch because that's where our next seam is going to go. And then we're ready for our next step. And another little tip, before each step I like to turn over my hoop and trim away the threads. It'll just be easier in the long run if that's done with each different step. For the next step, step 3, on section 1, we're going to take fabric 6 and we're going to place it right side to fabric 2. And just a little tip, we have an angled seam here. I like to turn this fabric at a 45-degree angle and line up the fold with the stitching line and then just open it out, and that's right where it's going to stitch so that when you flip it up it'll be a perfect alignment. So that's what I'm going to do with both of these. Fold it over 45-degree angle, line it up with my stitching line. Same with this one. When I fold over the 45, you can see I'm putting these two raw edges together here. And I'll just line it up with my stitching line and open it out. And now the next important step before we stitch this is to put your neutral thread in your needle. And I chose to use a darker color than the wash away because it'll help me align it to the block later on. So we'll stitch this seam and come back and do the next one. So we're ready to do step 3 and 4, and it's the seam. So I like to bring my bobbin thread up, again to avoid a big wad of thread on the back. It's very helpful. And then we'll just go ahead and stitch our seam. So this was step 3, and if I fold it back, you'll see that it's going to work out just fine. So the next one is step 4, and again I'm going to bring my bobbin thread up. And go ahead and stitch the seam. So now I've got it set up for 5 and 6, and when you get going on these, you can go ahead and place these all at once, but for the video I slowed it down step by step. So I placed it the same way. I lined up my seam line with my 45-degree angle, and I'm going to go ahead and sew the seam for step 5 and step 6, which would be over here. So before I go on, I'm going to go ahead and trim up my threads, and we'll come back and do the next step. So I turned my hoop over to clip my threads, and I wanted to point out the reason we put the gray thread in the needle for the seam. You can see a little bit of gray thread back here, which will help you a lot when you go to align this section to your block in the next step. So that's why we chose a thread color other than white. So it's a great tip. If you remember to do it, you'll be very happy. So before we go on, we need to go ahead and trim off all these little corners, leaving a scant 1/4 inch. So I'll do that, and I'll be right back for our next step. So our next step is to change back to the water-soluble thread in the needle, and we're going to flip these little pieces up. And again, we like to use the glue pen. It acts like a temporary iron and really holds it nice and flat. So you'll place your glue, you'll turn your fabric up and finger press that seam nice and tight and press it down to the glue. We'll do that on all 4 corners, and again put the wash away thread in, and we'll tack these down. So the next few steps will be the wash away thread to tack this down. I've gone ahead and pulled my bobbin thread up to begin with, and I'll let it tack down that section. And then the next section, and we will continue till they were all 4 of them are tacked down. So I've got them all tacked down. I'm going to go ahead and trim away my threads. Turn it over as well. And clean up the back. And you can see by not having the thread cutter on and by drawing your bobbin thread up when you start a seam that you end up with a nice clean back, which will help you later on when you go to attach this to your block. So the next step is marking for the trimming. So we need to mark on the top of them 1/4 inch is where we're gonna trim that 1/4 inch, and the rest is gonna be 1/2 inch. So we'll come back later and trim these up. So as I said, following your instructions, look for the red area where it says 1/4 inch, and I mark that area with just a friction pen or any type of fabric pen that'll wash away in the seam allowance, and I just put a little star because I know I'm going to trim 1/4 inch there, and everywhere else will be 1/2 inch. So I will take this out of the hoop and get it trimmed up for you. So I've taken my section 1s out of the hoop, and I've marked where my 1/4 inch is with just a little purple mark with my friction pen or any fabric marking pen. So we've aligned these in the hoop, so you can go ahead and trim the outside edges because they're lined up perfectly with each other. So this top edge is 1/4 inch because that's where my mark is. So I'm using my Trimmer by George ruler side and trimming my 1/4 inch, and then I'll turn it. And this edge has no mark, so this one gets 1/2 inch. And the bottom edge also gets 1/2 inch. And the last side gets another 1/2 inch. So I'm like this. So next I need to cut the two apart. So the bottom edge of this section will be 1/2 inch. So this one's done. And then this one has the little mark, so that gets 1/4 inch. So here are my two sections, all trimmed up and ready to go. And just a little side note, sometimes you might see this where I have less fabric here than my 1/4 inch, and it's because I didn't align it so perfectly, and that's okay because we have our cutaway. So it'll work out just fine, so don't worry about that. So now we'll go on to section 2. Time to do section 2. So here's a look at a completed section 2 and the instructions. And we're going to use fabric 1 and fabric 5. And I've already got those cut into my rectangles. And another tip for you, when you're using your cutaway stabilizer, the one I have is very wide and there's a lot of waste when you cut it off. So I saved those sections and I zigzag them together. And I put the seam about in the middle of the hoop so that my two sections can sew here, so I can get a little bit of savings that way. So now I'm going to move on to step 1, which is wash away thread in the needle, and I'll stitch the placement stitch. So I've stitched step 1, I've cleaned up my threads on the front and the back, and now I'm going to place fabric 1 over this middle section. So I'll draw my little line of glue and I'll put fabric 1 right side up. I want to make sure I have my 1/4 inch there and at the other side and about 1/4 inch at the top, and there'll be 1/2 inch at the bottom. So I'll place both my sections and come back and tack them down with my wash away thread. So I've placed my fabric 5 for steps 3, 4, 5, and 6, which are the seams, just like in section 1. And this time they're facing this direction. because when they stitch, the seam is going this direction, so they will fold out this way. So a little tip, I did the same thing where I turn it back 45 degrees and align my stitching line. And just another little tip, this edge is about a ½ inch below the basting line here. So that's where I have all of those lined up. And again, I'm going to use my darker colored thread in the needle to sew the seam, which will help me later in placement. So let's get going on steps 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is the snoring you hear in the background. 2 snoozing pugs. So my seams are stitched. I'm going to go ahead and cut these little seam allowances off on all 4, and we'll come back and glue them down and tack them with water-soluble thread. So we have them all trimmed. Now we're going to come in with our glue pen again and draw just around the edge. Turn our fabric right side up and finger press the seam really well and glue down that section. The reason we use the glue pen is to hold it really, really tight. It's important that these sections have really tight seam allowances there and not have any excess fabric, so they match up well. So I'll repeat that for these top sections, and then we'll come back with wash away thread and tack them down. So here's my completed section 2 with the little ends tacked down, and according to my instructions I need to again mark both tops for the 1/4 inch trimming. So I will unhoop this and I'll trim the perimeter and then trim the 2 apart, and we'll come back and show you what sections 1 and 2 look like. So here's our completed section 1 and 2, and you can see this is where it will go on the block when it's done. So you'll piece this part of your block and then you'll attach section 1 and section 2 with match points, and be sure to look at that video to learn how to match it up perfectly. Now we'll move on to section 3.